I've tried to step up whenever they needed. They don't ask us managers for much help, which when Rob Pitts was talking about staffing the State Farm Arena, they never reach out to us managers in North Fulton County to come and help with early voting. I've made extensive efforts to try to help, to try to be a manager, and then I find out that unexperienced people are managing precincts. So it was a bit frustrating listening to this morning. But I did, through a lot of effort, was able to get tech certified, and I was trained by Dominion to be a poll tech worker. And last minute, they said I could come down to the warehouse because they needed help. I went down to the warehouse for 5.5 days. I was there from 8 a.m. to approximately 10 p.m. My job was primarily printing test ballots, and these were real ballots. I had reams of roll-in paper behind my desk, and I could print ballots all day long. And I did, pretty much, because we had to run tests, 21 ballots for every section of a precinct. Some precincts had 4 sections, so we'd have 80-some ballots. It was quite common that these ballots would go lost or missing, and we would have to reprint them. Kind of a bummer. So in my course of printing these ballots, and when we made mistakes, before I put them in the shredder case, I would spoil them, because as a manager, I know, like, this is a real ballot. I can't let it get in the wrong hands. And so I started spoiling them, and the girl who was over me, who had no poll worker experience, she's a friend of the Dominion person, she's like, "What are you doing?" And I said, "I'm spoiling ballots before I put them in this suitcase that's just in the middle of the room." And she kind of questioned, and then I went over one day and I pulled out a stack of ballots out of that case that was unattended, that was 8 inches high. So throughout the day, I put them next to me, and I just started tearing them, because I could tear more than mark each one through, and spoiled ballots. The next day, the girl who was over me, she came to me and she said that she spoke to the head Dominion girl, and that what I was doing was correct, that they were way too loose with the ballots in the warehouse. But there was no directive for anybody else to spoil ballots, and I never went back in the suitcase and pulled out extra ballots. Then on Friday, when early voting concluded, I was just working at my little station, and some other tech poll workers that were trained like me came up and said, "Bridget, you're a manager, is this correct?" And I'm like, what's going on? And they're like, "They're just pulling out ballots." And they had brought all the tabulator scanners out from State Farm Arena and wheeled them in the warehouse. And I guess I should back up. The warehouse was run by Dominion people because the Fulton County employees had a COVID outbreak. So they were all quarantined, 24 of them. So this was all run by Dominion software people. And I realized they probably have never worked an election, and they don't know the security and the preciousness of a ballot, of someone's vote. So I went over to look at the situation with the coworkers, and I was quickly reprimanded and told, "Bridget, it's fine. We've been doing this all week." And I didn't know what to say because I had no authority. I was bothered by it, and I told the poll workers, I'm like, well, the media card's what's really important. The paper ballots are just backups. So it'll be okay. They're not going to need these paper ballots anyway. And I was uncomfortable, and I walked away. I went back to my desk to print more test ballots. I had a break. I went over and just helped a gentleman pull ballots out, throw them in a suitcase. People left for dinner, just left the ballots sitting on the floor, unattended. I left that night at 10 p.m., and there was still a suitcase with ballots that I passed as I was walking out the door. It was completely unattended, just left there. And I was uncomfortable with it, but I went ahead and left. The next morning, I came into the warehouse. And by the way, to get in the warehouse, you just had to say, "I'm with Fulton County Elections." They buzzed you in. Anybody could go in. There was a loading dock. Anybody could drive up to the loading dock and walk in the building. And one woman actually did, and she was kicked out later in the day. So I walked out in that morning, and that there were no Dominion employees there. There were probably 10 of us there, and all the ballot suitcases were sealed, and they were just stacked in the corner of the warehouse. And for me, I thought, this is just not secure. Someone could just wheel these. I could have wheeled them out to my car. I could have wheeled them to the loading dock. I could have changed out ballots. I could have done anything. So that was Friday, but I tried not to worry about it. Then on Sunday, it was my last day in the warehouse. And I was just sticking around because in case they lost ballots again, I would be there to reprint. But I had nothing to do, so I decided I would leave the desk, and there was no other people printing test ballots that night. I thought I would leave my desk and I would go out into the floor and help. So I was away for an hour or so. It was 10 o'clock at night. I thought, it's time for me to go. And I go to my desk, and there's a Dominion worker, and there was a consultant who had been in the warehouse that whole week. I thought he was a warehouse consultant. I've now figured out he's not a warehouse consultant. He was from the elections group. He was from Chicago. The two of them were printing ballots. And I thought, oh my gosh, they need some more test ballots. They lost test ballots. So I sat down and I'm like, oh, let me help you guys. What do you need? And do I start from the bottom? Do I start from the top? And the Dominion worker was like, oh, you can start from the bottom. And so I started. And then he's like, well, I got to go. Then the consultant guy who was printing ballots, I look over and I notice he's printing random ballots. I'm like, there's an order when you print test ballots. The purpose of a test ballot is so that you can vote for each candidate. So you either start from the top and vote for the first person all the way across, and then the second person, etc. This guy was just printing random ballots. And so I went over and instructed him, hey, you know, to print test ballots, you got to do it this way. And he's like, oh, do I have to vote for Trump? I'm like, yeah, you got to vote for Trump. And then he started printing some ballots, and then he said he had to leave, so he left. And it was 10 o'clock at night, so I just finished up printing that batch of test ballots, ran it over to the person, and then I left. So then I'm also a precinct manager. So I manage the precinct and I'm concerned over the emergency ballots. You guys passed a law that 10% of every voter in the poll book, you have to have an emergency ballot. Well, in my precinct, I got yellow sample ballots. They were on yellow cheap paper, said sample across them. So I got 250 of these. So I called the warehouse. I said, where are my emergency ballots? I mean, I hope I don't need them, but where are they? And I took a picture, sent them a picture, and they're like, yeah, that's not right, and we don't know where they are. We can't find them. And in my training as a manager, I've never been trained the importance of securing the emergency ballots. When I've gone into the check-in center at the end of the night, there's no accountability. In the June election, they didn't even have forms when they checked us in. They didn't have ballot recap sheets, which is the most important thing you need as well, but they didn't have check-in forms to say, hey, you turned in all your provisional ballots that were unused. You turned in all your emergency ballots. There's no checking. The next election, you think, okay, that was the first time we used the system. Maybe they'll get it right. So the second time I went to check in, they had the old check-in forms with old language, DREs. And I'm like, okay, I'll sign off, but here's all my emergency ballots, here's all my unused provisional ballots. So you think the third time they would get a form. I go to check in that night, they don't have forms. The girl at the Roswell check-in center said she just made one up. But there was nowhere on there to say, Bridget had 250 emergency ballots, and she's turned in those ballots. There's nowhere to say that my provisional ballots, I'm a split precinct, so I did have proper provisional ballots for my B precinct, but none for my A precinct. So that was concerning. And I did write my superior at Fulton County Elections, and she sent it on to her superiors, and I've not heard back about my concerns. I did send it to the Secretary of State. I sent my concerns prior to the election, and they were supposed to forward it on to the correct people. I went back to the Secretary of State after the election with my post-election concerns. I've not heard back from the Secretary of State. I attended the Board of Elections meeting this last week on Monday morning while I was in the airport, and I was going to give my testimony of securing the ballots, and I was muted 15 seconds into my presentation. So I feel like I'm not heard, or it's not a concern. I was also concerned about the Fulton County. Rob Pitts didn't mention to you this morning, but they had ACLU clerks in every single Fulton County location to process absentee ballots. I was concerned because my clerk was not trained. She was trained the day before. She seemed very intelligent. She's a lawyer. She wasn't trained to collect an affidavit if you're clearing an absentee ballot. I was also concerned that she was using her personal laptop, but I guess that's fine to have the whole voter database and who turned in absentee ballots and who didn't on your personal laptop. So those are just some of my concerns. I kind of went around, so I'm sure you have some questions.
Okay. Thank you.
Are there any questions from any of the Senator Heath?
I don't want to jump ahead of any of you smart guys in here. You just, there's a lot of information there that could.
I'm sorry.
There was a lot of information there that could certainly cause me concern. But one of the last things you were talking about, these emergency ballots, and you mentioned the absentee ballots. So who all knows, if I request an absentee ballot, who all knows whether or not I have voted that absentee ballot?
In previous years, we would have to call downtown to the Fulton County elections, and they would clear a voter to vote on the machines. In this election, there was a lot of snafus because there were so many absentee ballots sent out back in June. So the solution was to put an ACLU absentee clerk in every precinct that would do the job of the Fulton County people, because the phones would jam. And I would have 3 poll workers on the phone calling the 3 different lines, and we would just sit there and let it ring and ring and ring until someone got through. And then we'd clear our line of voters that we had so they could go vote on the machines. But I don't know, maybe that's public information of who has turned in their absentee ballot. It seems like if it was public information, then I would have loved to have been able to look it up myself on my phone.
Do you have any concern that if I knew which available absentee ballots were out there and uncast, that it might be a good opportunity to do whatever with, whether it was call them up and say, hey, you need to go vote today, or
You haven't turned in your ballot? Can I come get it?
Can I come help you, or whatever?
Mm-hmm.
Help me with these emergency ballots. Is that what you called them?
Yes, emergency ballots.
So these are legitimate ballots.
Yes, supposedly.
And so how are they used they're to be used in a voting precinct? Mm-hmm. And what condition would you need an emergency ballot in a voting precinct?
So an example that they give us in our training classes is if, like my precinct's in a school. So if the school person doesn't show up to open up the school and I need to open up the polls, I can go ahead and open up the polls on the sidewalk with emergency ballots until I can get in the school.
And let people vote on those ballots and drop them in your briefcase or whatever?
They give us a orange bag. I mean, fortunately, I've never had to do this, but they give us an orange bag for provisional, because I'm not allowed to touch a ballot once someone has cast a ballot.
And so what happens to them? What happens to that orange bag after that? Are they then fed through the ballot scanning device, or?
So it depends. Like if you had a power failure and you were in your precinct, all the scanner tabulator, either the cabinet or the standalone, have an emergency ballot drop box. So I did process 5 emergency ballots back in June because our cards weren't printing correctly, and it took us a little bit of time to get the card thing working right. So I let 5 people vote emergency, and they went over and they filled them out, and then they dropped them in the emergency drop box. And then at a slow point in the day, I have to announce to the entire precinct that I'm opening that emergency ballot box. I have to have 2 people with me, and I can take them out, I can touch them, and then I put them through the scanner myself.
Senator Dolezal?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Ms. Thorne, for being here. I've got 2 different things I'd like to ask you about. The first one, you just said something that caught my attention. What was the role of the ACLU? And you said they were in every precinct. How do you know they were in every precinct? But what did you observe them doing?
On Sunday, while I was in the warehouse working as a tech, my supervisor sent an email. She's over all of North Fulton County, and she gave us bullet points of what we needed to do to prepare for the election. And the last bullet point was that we would have an ACLU clerk in every precinct to process ballots, absentee ballots.
I've read our code, and I don't read anything in Georgia law about having an ACLU. Would you say it was an ACLU tech?
It was an ACLU clerk.
Clerk, I'm sorry, ACLU
so
clerk.
I assumed it was just an ACLU lawyer.
What were they doing?
So if a voter came in, and most voters aren't familiar with absentee ballots, if they want to vote on the machines, they don't bring their ballots. And so to make sure that they haven't already voted or already cast their absentee ballot, we have to get them cleared so that we can issue a card to vote on the machines. If they bring their ballot in, it's no problem. We just spoil it, put it in an envelope, and then they're able to vote on the machines.
Okay. I want to go back to really your primary function, it sounds like, in this election. You were a poll tech worker working for Dominion to, I believe, fulfill this provision of our law that requires on the 3rd day before a primary election or the 5th day before a general election, essentially test the scanners, right? Print out the known set of ballots with a known result, run those through the scanners, and ensure that scanner delivers the result of the known set of ballots. Is that accurate?
Yes, but my primary job was just printing the test ballots.
So,
but the one night where I was went out on the floor and did run an actual test, I went through and I realized that I printed 2 for Kelly Loeffler accidentally, but it was kind of late, so I just went ahead and ran it. And when I took my card to Dominion, it passed the test anyway.
where was this taking place? Was this
In the Georgia World Congress Center, Building B.
Okay, and you were requested to be there by the Fulton County Election Board, the people you've worked with before, but Dominion was actually facilitating
Yes.
the function of the test. I guess approximately how many scanners would you say that you all had to test?
Oh, geez. There were 255 precincts. Each has 1 scanner. Even mine, with only 2,000 voters, they sent 2 scanners. So, I don't know, maybe, 400.
In our code, it speaks to this being done by the superintendent. Would you say that the Fulton County staff was in charge of this process, or were you receiving your primary direction from Dominion staff?
I was receiving it from Dominion staff.
Okay. And you said this took the course over a couple of days to test these
I was there
500
5.5
ballots.
days, but people were there a week before me.
What day did you all conclude your work?
Sunday night, I believe.
The Sunday night before the election?
It was strange because I would leave thinking there was no work to be done, and they didn't need my help anymore, but there were a group of people that would always stay, and then I'd come back the next day, and they're like, "Oh, we stayed till 2 a.m."
Just to clarify, this is the Sunday before the election that you
Correct.
all concluded your work. So you all did not fulfill the Georgia law that says honor before the 3rd day. before the election, because you were finishing on the second day before the election.
Yes, correct. But that might have been due to the COVID and not using the regular staff.
Okay. I appreciate your time, and thank you for clarifying that for me.
Senator Summers?
Mr. Chairman, Ms. Thorne, is there any way you can estimate the improprieties roughly that you saw? I know you're not, you can't, it won't hold water, but I mean, how many votes do these improprieties you spoke of possibly could that have represented? Any way of knowing that number?
Yeah, I have no idea. I failed to mention the Friday after they emptied the ballots, people in the warehouse were coming up to me and bringing me ballots and asking, are these real ballots or test ballots? And I honestly had no way of telling. And so we would just spoil the ballot and put it away.
What's a test ballot?
It's the one that we're using to test the scanners, the tabulators.
Thank you. Senator Parent, did you have a question?
Oh, yeah, I was just gonna, no, I really don't. I was just gonna clarify for Senator Dolezal about the ACLU Deputy Registrar's Program.
Okay, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, so the ACLU, we had a choke point, especially during early voting, with people that had requested absentee ballots but decided they wanted to vote in person. So to help eliminate that choke point, ACLU launched this Deputy Registrar's Program that attorneys could participate in and be trained to add additional staff to cancel the absentees and let the people vote in person. And they partnered with Fulton. We actually wanted them to partner with DeKalb, and that ended up not happening. But yeah, it's not, you're not going to find it in the code.
They just weren't trained to take an affidavit before they cleared the ballot, which is kind of a huge snafu on my part, I would say.
Anything? Mr. Smith, did you have anything? Okay. Okay. Thank you, Ms. Thorne.